That night, the 1 a.m. doorbell rang like a gunshot. My daughter Sarah collapsed on the welcome mat, her ragged breaths mixing with the smear of blood on her lip. Robert had done this, and in that moment, I knew my father's old hunting rifle wasn't just for show anymore. It wasn't a nightmare. Nightmares end. They have the decency to dissolve with the morning light. The image I saw that night, it still burned into the back of my mind. A photograph developed in the darkest room of my memory. The cold of the linoleum floor seeped through my socks as I knelt beside her, the familiar checkered pattern of my kitchen floors suddenly feeling alien and hostile beneath my knees. Welcome back to the channel. I'm your narrator, and tonight I'm sharing something deeply personal. A story about broken promises and how a father had to find his own way to bring justice home for his daughter. If you're listening out there, let me know where you're from in the comments below. It's good to know we're not alone on these long nights, in these quiet rooms filled with memories. Robert's shadow had already vanished into the darkness of the street, the squeal of his tires a fading punctuation mark on his cowardice. He left only the sour smell of cheap whiskey clinging to Sarah's coat, a scent that seemed to permeate the very fabric of the night. I helped her inside, my arm around her shaking shoulders. Her body felt weightless in my arms, unnervingly so, as if she were a hollowed-out version of the girl I raised. She was as fragile as a bird with a broken wing. It wasn't until we were under the harsh, unforgiving yellow light of the kitchen that I saw the full extent of the damage. One of her cheeks was swollen, the skin already beginning to blossom into a dark, ugly shade of purple. Her lip was split clean through, the blood already starting to dry and crack like parched earth. She tried to smile at me, a twisted, painful grimace that was a mockery of the real thing. It didn't come close to reaching her eyes. Her eyes were vacant. "I fell down the stairs, Dad," she mumbled, the lie so automatic, so rehearsed, it came out as easily as breathing. Even then, bruised and trembling in the sanctuary of my kitchen, her first instinct was to throw a shield around the very man who had hurt her. I didn't say a word. I couldn't. Words felt useless, inadequate. Instead, I soaked a dish towel in warm water from the tap and gently, so gently, began to clean the blood from her face. The helplessness I felt in that moment, it was a physical weight, a granite block settling in my chest, making it hard to draw a full breath. For 40 years, I'd worn a badge. I'd faced down men with knives and guns. I'd walked into the heart of chaos and restored order with my presence and my voice. But this was a different kind of monster, one that had been hiding in plain sight, living under the guise of family. And I felt utterly, completely useless. Sarah was shivering, a deep, bone-rattling cold that had nothing to do with the night air. It was the chill of shock, of terror. I told her to take a hot shower, to wash the night and his touch away, and handed her one of my old, soft flannel shirts to wear. Something of mine, something safe. As she stood in the hallway and pulled off her own long-sleeved sweater, my heart seized for a second, a painful, stuttering beat in my chest. There, wrapped around both of her upper arms, were dark, mottled bruises. They were shaped like fingerprints, huge, angry marks left by someone who had gripped her, pinned her, held her down, while they did whatever else they did. They weren't from a fall. You don't get matching handprints on your arms from falling down a set of stairs. These were the marks of a struggle, of violent restraint. She saw me looking, her eyes widening in a flicker of panic, and she quickly pulled the sleeves of my shirt down, hiding the evidence. But it was too late. I had already seen them. And in that instant, something inside me shifted, a fundamental realignment of my soul. The comforting father receded, and the cop, the man I'd been for 4 decades, took his place. A cold, clear focus washed over me. This wasn't a domestic accident. This wasn't a family matter. This was a crime scene. And my daughter was the victim. I made her a cup of chamomile tea, the way her mother Martha used to whenever one of us was sick or couldn't sleep. The familiar ritual felt hollow, a ghost of a comfort. Sarah's hands were shaking so badly that the cup rattled against the saucer, so I had to hold the warm mug steady for her while she took a sip. I sat across from her at the old oak table, the same table where she'd done her homework as a little girl, where we'd carved pumpkins and decorated Christmas cookies. The memories felt like a betrayal now. I waited. I kept my face impassive, my training kicking in, and I just waited for her to speak. But Sarah said nothing more. She just stared down into the teacup, her reflection wavering on the surface, as if the answer she was looking for were floating in the dregs of the leaves. Her silence was more damning than the bruises, more terrifying than any confession. It was a testament to the depth of his control, a fear so deeply ingrained that she couldn't speak the truth, even in the one place in the entire world she should have felt safest, her father's house. I knew I couldn't push her, not tonight. Pushing would only make her retreat further. Tonight was about getting her home, about letting her feel the solid walls of this house around her, the rest of it, the fight that could wait for the morning. But inside me, in the cold, quiet chambers of my heart, it had already begun. Later, long after she'd fallen into an exhausted, twitching sleep, I went to make up her old room. Martha had kept it just as it was, a perfect time capsule of a teenage girl's life. Posters of bands I'd never heard of were still taped to the walls, their youthful faces frozen in time. Her high school yearbooks and worn paperback novels were lined up neatly on the shelf. The faint, sweet scent of the dried lavender sachets Martha always tucked in the closets still lingered in the air, a whisper of her presence. It was a room of innocence, of hope. As I smoothed the fresh sheets on the bed, my hand brushed against a picture frame on her nightstand. It was from her wedding day, Sarah and Robert smiling, looking so damn happy and full of promise. I looked at that man, shook his hand, and believed my daughter had found someone who would protect her, who would cherish her, a good man. Tonight proved how catastrophically, unforgivably wrong I had been. I picked up the frame, with its smiling silver-plated lie, and placed it face down on the nightstand. I couldn't bear to look at it for another second. Around 3 a.m, a sound from her room pulled me from a shallow, restless doze. It was a soft sound, barely audible. Not loud weeping, but small, muffled sobs. The kind of crying you do when you're trying desperately not to be heard, when you've been conditioned to believe that even your grief is an inconvenience. It was the sound of someone who had learned to grieve in silence, to hide her pain even when she was alone. I stood outside her closed door for a long time, my hands clenched into white-knuckled fists at my sides. Every one of her choked sobs felt like a punch to my gut, a personal indictment of my failure as a father. I was Lieutenant Thomas Fitzgerald. My job, my entire identity for as long as I could remember, was built on protecting the innocent. And I hadn't been able to protect my own daughter. A cold, sharp mixture of guilt and rage churned inside me, a poison with no antidote. I didn't go in. What could I say? What comfort could I offer that wouldn't sound like a hollow platitude? Instead, I went back downstairs and sat in my armchair in the dark living room, where I had a clear view of her bedroom door. I wouldn't sleep tonight. I would keep watch, just like I did when she was a little girl, convinced there was a monster in her closet. The irony was a bitter pill to swallow. The monster was real this time. In the heavy silence of the house, surrounded by the ghosts of a happier time, I made a silent promise to Martha, a one-sided conversation with her portrait on the mantel. "I'll fix this, Marty, I promise you. Robert would pay for what he'd done, not with blind revenge. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of dragging me into the mud with him. He would pay with justice, cold, methodical, and inescapable. It was the promise of a father, and it was the oath of a cop. The next morning, the sun rose with a kind of indifferent cheerfulness. I didn't give Sarah a choice. I poured her a cup of coffee, black the way I drink it. "We're going to the hospital," I said, my voice leaving no room for argument. She started to protest, the same weak excuses from the night before. "I'm fine, Dad, really." But I just held her gaze over the rim of my coffee mug and repeated the words, slower this time, each one a stone dropping into a quiet pool. "We are going." The drive was silent, wrapped in a thick, uncomfortable tension. I had the morning news on the radio, an old habit, but the cheerful chatter of the hosts about local politics and the weather forecast felt alien and intrusive, like voices from another, simpler world. At the emergency room waiting area, I watched Sarah. I saw the way she flinched and drew into herself whenever a doctor or another patient walked past our chairs too quickly. That wasn't a natural reaction. That was a reflex born from living in a constant state of fear, of anticipating the next sudden movement, the next blow. When the nurse finally called her name, I stood up with her. "I'll be right out here," I told her, my voice softer than I intended. Part of me wanted to give her the privacy to speak freely with the doctor. The other, larger part was just trying to keep my own anger from boiling over in that sterile, quiet waiting room, a place that reeked of rubbing alcohol and quiet suffering. The doctor was a young man, probably younger than Sarah, but his eyes were serious and professional. After he'd examined her, he asked to speak with me alone in a small office that smelled of antiseptic wipes and latex gloves. "Her wrist is sprained," he began, getting straight to the point, for which I was grateful. "And there's a hairline fracture on her 7th rib. These injuries," he paused, looking me directly in the eye, his gaze unwavering, "are consistent with being violently shoved or kicked." He slid a copy of the medical report across the small desk toward me. I picked it up. My hand was steady, a cop's hand. Every clinical, detached word, contusion, fracture, ligament damage, was a cold, hard description of the brutality my daughter had endured. "We're mandated reporters, Lieutenant," the doctor said softly. "You know we have to file this." I gave a slow, deliberate nod. My throat was too tight to speak. "I know. Send the official report to me." Holding that piece of paper, that clinical black and white documentation of his violence, I finally had it. My first piece of evidence. The rage was still there, a hot coal in my chest, but now it had a purpose. It wasn't blind emotion anymore. It was the foundation of a case. On the way home, I pulled into a diner, one of those old-school places with cracked red vinyl booths and a waitress who calls everyone Hun. I needed a cup of strong black coffee, and I needed to make a phone call away from Sarah's hearing. I ordered 2 coffees to go and then dialed Frank's number. Frank and I served together in the Army, long before we both ended up back in this town. Now we were in the same VFW post. He was one of the few men on this earth I trusted completely, a man who understood that some things didn't need a lot of words. I didn't waste time with pleasantries or explanations. "Frank," I said when he picked up, "I need you to run a name for me, Robert Henderson. See what you can find, anything." Frank didn't ask why. He didn't ask if everything was okay. He just said, "Give me an hour." That's how men like us operate. A problem is stated, a solution is sought. There's no room for hand-wringing or emotional debate. Exactly 60 minutes later, as I was pulling into my driveway with the still hot coffees in the cup holder, my phone rang. It was Frank. "Tomas, this guy's not clean," he said, his voice grim and flat. "He's got a prior for assault and battery. Happened 5 years ago. Looks like a bar fight. Pleaded down to a lesser charge. Case was settled out of court." The breath left my body in a rush, as if I'd been punched. a piece of his past Sarah had never told me about, a piece he had deliberately hidden. Maybe she was ashamed. Maybe she was hopeful, believing the lie he surely sold her, that it was a one-time thing, that he'd changed. My heart ached for her, for the weight of that secret. She had been carrying this burden, living with this knowledge, all by herself for who knows how long. Any last shred of doubt I might have harbored evaporated like mist in the morning sun. This wasn't a mistake. This was a pattern, and it would never stop unless someone made it stop. When I got inside, Sarah was on the sofa, curled up under an Afghan Martha had crocheted years ago, a rainbow of faded colors. She looked so small, so lost in my big living room. With a little prompting, the story started to come out in small, broken pieces. She told me about the fight, how it started over something stupid, something about money. And then she told me about the necklace, her mother's necklace, the one Robert had ripped from her throat in his rage, the delicate chain snapping and leaving a thin red scratch on her skin. It wasn't just a piece of silver jewelry. It was the last thing I'd ever given Martha before she got sick. That he would dare to put his hands on it, to violate that sacred memory, it was a desecration. "I don't know where it went," Sarah whispered, fresh tears welling in her eyes and spilling down her bruised cheek. It must have gotten lost in the struggle. But I knew better. Men like Robert, they don't lose things of value, they turn them into cash. I told Sarah to try and get some rest. Then I got back in my truck and drove downtown. Our town isn't big, there are only 3 pawn shops. I started at the one closest to their house, a dingy little place with a flickering neon sign and iron bars on the windows. I showed the owner, a tired-looking man with weary eyes, a photo of Robert from my wallet. He recognized him immediately. "Yeah, he was in here," the man said, wiping the dusty glass counter with a rag. "Yesterday afternoon, pawned a silver necklace." He reached into the glass display case, his hand moving past a sad collection of wedding rings and old watches, and pulled it out. There it was. The delicate little snowflake pendant I'd bought from Martha for our first Christmas together, a lifetime ago. I paid the man what he'd given Robert for it, plus interest. The cold weight of the metal in my palm felt more chilling than the autumn air outside. This wasn't just evidence of an assault anymore. This was evidence of his contempt for everything we held sacred. This was proof of his soul's decay. The next day, I drove through Sarah and Robert's neighborhood. It was a typical Midwestern suburban street, a place of carefully manicured lawns and identical-looking houses where everything on the surface seemed perfectly in order. A place where secrets could fester behind closed doors. I saw a couple of the neighbors out doing yard work, an older couple, probably retired like me. I pulled over and got out, making small talk about the weather before getting to the point. I asked if they'd noticed anything unusual lately, anything out of the ordinary next door. They exchanged a look, a quick, hesitant glance that told me everything. Finally, the wife admitted it, her voice low. She'd heard shouting sometimes, the occasional crash like something being thrown or broken. "But you know," she said, looking down at her gardening gloves as if they held a deep fascination, "you don't want to get involved in other people's family business." I thanked them for their time and walked back to my truck. The disappointment was a bitter taste in my mouth, but it didn't surprise me. It just confirmed a hard truth I'd learned long ago on the force. In a fight like this, most of the time, you're on your own. I decided it was time to let Robert know the rules of the game had changed. Sitting in my truck at the end of his street, I called him. I kept my voice steady, professional, the same neutral tone I'd use on any official police call. "Robert, it's Tomas. I think we need to talk about Sarah." The line was silent for a moment. I could hear the faint, inane sound of a game show on a TV in the background. Then he answered, his voice laced with a familiar, arrogant challenge. "Oh yeah? What's she been telling you now? Crying on your shoulder?" I ignored the bait. Bait was for amateurs. "I'm coming over to the house in an hour," I said, my voice flat and final. "Alone." I didn't phrase it as a question or a request. I hung up before he could respond. This wasn't a negotiation. It was an announcement. I was letting the animal know I was aware of its presence in my woods, and I was coming to have a look around. Their house smelled of neglect, a miasma of stale beer, old takeout containers, and something that smelled vaguely like despair. Empty bottles littered the coffee table like fallen soldiers. Robert was slouched in his recliner trying to look casual, but I could see the tight set of his jaw, the way his fingers drummed restlessly on the arm of the chair. I didn't sit down. I stood in the middle of his living room, forcing him to look up at me. It's a small thing, a shift in power dynamics, but it matters. "Sarah's with me," I stated simply. "She'll be staying there for a while." He shrugged, a dismissive gesture meant to show me how little he cared, how little power I had. "Her choice. You know how women are, always making a big deal out of nothing." That single sentence, the casual, condescending way he dismissed her pain, it made the blood pound in my ears. But I kept my face a mask of indifference. I couldn't let him see he was getting to me. This wasn't about emotion. This was about observation. I was there to gauge his reaction, to see how he played his hand when he knew I was watching. That night he called me. The pretense of civility was gone, washed away by a tide of whiskey. His voice was thick and ugly, slurring with a sick, possessive rage. "Who the hell do you think you are?" he shouted into the phone, his voice cracking. "You can't keep her from me." Then came the threats, ugly and specific. "When I get my hands on her, I'm going to teach her another lesson, put her back in her place." He went on, describing what he'd do, using words like slap and punch with a chilling relish. I stood there in the quiet of my kitchen and listened, my phone pressed tight against my ear, saying nothing, letting him dig his own grave one syllable at a time. That drunken, rambling phone call was a confession, a gift, and I had my phone's recorder on the entire time. As soon as he hung up, I went out to the garage. The cold, white light of the single fluorescent bulb hummed overhead, casting sharp shadows on the tools hanging on the pegboard. I rummaged through my toolbox until I found what I needed, a brand new, heavy-duty deadbolt, the best one they sold at the hardware store. It's a simple task, changing a lock, something I've done a dozen times. But tonight, it felt different. It felt like a ritual. Each turn of the screwdriver, each metallic click of the tumblers was an affirmation. This is my house. This is my fortress. My daughter is here, and no one is getting through that door to hurt her again. The solid, final thunk of the new bolt sliding into place was the most satisfying sound I'd heard in days. It was the sound of security. Back inside, I went to my study and opened the old oak gun cabinet that had been my father's. Inside, resting on a bed of faded green felt, was his Winchester hunting rifle. I took it out, the familiar weight of the polished wood and cold steel, a solid, comforting presence in my hands. I had no intention of using it. That wasn't my way. That was Robert's way. But the act of cleaning it, of oiling the mechanism and feeling the precise, mechanical click of the action as I worked the lever, it focused my mind. It was a tangible reminder of the difference between strength and violence. Robert used violence because he was weak, pathetic, and inadequate. I had strength, but real strength lies in control, in discipline, in following the law even when your gut is screaming for vengeance. I would bring him down, yes, but I would do it my way, without lowering myself to his level. In the days that followed, a fragile sense of calm settled over the house, but Sarah's fear remained, a ghost that haunted her every move. She'd jump if the phone rang unexpectedly, her whole body going rigid. If I reached up too quickly to get a plate from a high shelf in the kitchen, she would flinch, her arms coming up instinctively to shield her face. Seeing those unconscious reactions, those deeply ingrained reflexes of trauma, was a constant, painful reminder of what she had lived through. It showed how the terror had been wired directly into her nervous system, a circuit of fear that fired without conscious thought. I found myself changing my own behavior, moving more slowly around the house, speaking in a softer voice, announcing my presence before entering a room. I realized my home couldn't just be a refuge from Robert. It had to be a place where her shattered sense of safety could begin to mend itself, piece by fragile piece. The hardest part, the thing that truly broke my heart, was hearing her blame herself. We were sitting in the living room one evening, the TV on, but neither of us watching, the flickering light casting dancing shadows on the walls. "I should have just kept my mouth shut," she said, her voice barely a whisper, directed at her own lap. "If I hadn't argued back about the bills, it wouldn't have gotten that bad." It was the twisted logic of the abused, a mind so thoroughly manipulated that it starts to believe the fault lies within, that the violence is a consequence of its own actions. I moved to sit beside her on the couch. I took the little snowflake necklace from my pocket and placed it gently in her palm, closing her fingers around it. "Sarah, look at me," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "This was not your fault. The only one at fault is the man who raises his hand. Never, ever think otherwise." One afternoon, when I knew for certain Robert was at his construction job, we drove over to her house to pick up some of her essential things. Just walking up to that front door was difficult for her. I could see it in the way she held her body, stiff and hesitant, her hand hovering over the doorknob for a long moment before she could bring herself to turn it. Inside, the house felt cold and unwelcoming, each room a container of tainted memories. She moved quickly, methodically, gathering clothes, some books, her toiletries. She worked with a grim efficiency, a soldier on a mission in enemy territory, avoiding looking at the photographs on the walls, the small trinkets that once meant something. As we were about to leave, she stood in the doorway of the living room and looked back at the furniture, the pictures on the wall. "All the rest of it," she said quietly, more to herself than to me. "It's all just stuff." In that moment, I saw the beginning of her liberation. She was starting to untangle her identity from the life she had built with him, realizing her own worth was not tied to a sofa or a set of dishes. I knew I couldn't handle the legal side of this alone. I was a cop, not a lawyer, and I needed an expert, someone who knew how to navigate this world. I did my research and made an appointment with the best family law attorney in the county, a woman named Eleanor Holloway. She was sharp, no nonsense, with eyes that seemed to see right through you, and a reputation for being a shark in the courtroom. In her quiet, organized office, surrounded by shelves of thick law books, I laid it all out. The doctor's report, the pawnshop receipt, the digital recording of Robert's threatening phone call, the statements I'd taken from the neighbors. I told her everything, my voice a low, steady monotone. She listened intently, her pen moving across a legal pad, not interrupting me once. When I finally finished, the silence in the room was heavy. She looked up from her notes, her expression unreadable. "Lieutenant Fitzgerald," she said, her voice calm and confident, "we have a very strong case." For the first time in what felt like an eternity, a genuine flicker of hope, hot and bright, ignited within me. Mrs. Holloway's first recommendation was to file for an emergency protective order, effective immediately. She explained the entire process to Sarah, speaking to her not as a fragile victim, but as a competent adult, an equal partner in the process. I watched my daughter as she listened. I saw her sit up straighter in her chair, her chin lift just a little. When the lawyer asked her directly, "Ms. Fitzgerald, do you authorize my office to proceed with this filing?" Sarah's voice was clear and steady when she replied, "Yes, I do." In that sterile conference room, I witnessed my daughter reclaim a piece of the power that had been stolen from her, the fundamental right to make decisions about her own life and her own safety. It was a small step, but it was a step forward. That night, for dinner, I made my pot roast, the one Sarah had loved since she was a little girl. The rich, savory smell of garlic and slow-cooked beef filled the house, chasing away some of the lingering shadows and replacing them with a scent of home, of normalcy. We sat at the kitchen table and ate, and for the first time since she'd arrived on my doorstep, the oppressive tension between us was gone. We talked about small things, the local baseball team's chances this year, the garden fence that needed mending, a funny story about a squirrel that kept raiding the bird feeder. It was a perfectly ordinary dinner, but in its very normalcy, it felt extraordinary. It was a quiet declaration that our lives would go on, that Robert did not have the power to steal these simple, peaceful moments from us anymore. You know, watching my daughter find that peace in my home, it got me thinking about what it means to be a father. You spend your life trying to build things, provide for your family, but sometimes the most important thing you can give your kids is just a safe room and a warm meal. For the fathers and grandfathers listening tonight, have you ever felt that? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. I knew Robert's habits. Thursday night was his night at O'Malley's Pub, a dark, wood-paneled place where he and his buddies would drink beer and pretend they were still young. I also knew I had to face him. Not for a fight. Getting into a brawl with him would only drag me down to his level, muddy the waters, and give his lawyer something to use against me. My purpose was different. I needed to see him, not on the other end of a phone line, but in his element, the place where he felt like a king, surrounded by his court of fools. And I needed other people to see him too. Sometimes the best way to expose a monster is to drag it into the light, even the dim, smoky light of a neighborhood bar. O'Malley's smelled the way it always did, like spilled beer, sawdust, and the faint, sweet odor of regret. The sharp crack of billiard balls echoed from the back room, and a football game played silently on the TVs mounted above the bar. There he was, holding court at the corner of the bar with a few other guys, laughing too loudly, performing the role of the regular, fun-loving guy. Watching him, a cold disgust settled in my stomach. I'd seen his type my whole career. The friendly public face was just a mask, a cheap disguise for the rottenness underneath. I ordered a club soda with lime, a clear signal that I wasn't there to drink or socialize. I found a spot at the far end of the bar, and I waited. I waited for 20 minutes, nursing my drink, letting him see me there, letting him wonder. I waited until his buddies got up and headed outside for a smoke break, leaving him alone. Then I made my move. I walked down the length of the bar and stood next to him. He turned, the phony smile on his face vanishing like a snuffed flame when he saw it was me. He started to say something, some smart remark, but I didn't give him the chance. I reached into the inner pocket of my jacket and silently laid 3 photographs on the polished, sticky wood of the bar top. I'd had them printed at the pharmacy that afternoon. The first was a close-up of Sarah's bruised and swollen face. The second showed the dark, finger-shaped bruises on her arms. The third was a clear shot of the doctor's report with the words, "hairline fracture" circled in red. I didn't say a single word. I let the pictures do the talking. Robert stared at them, his face flushing a deep, mottled red from a combination of whiskey and humiliation. His eyes, already bloodshot, widened in fury. He couldn't argue with the images in front of him. There was no lie he could spin that would erase them. So he resorted to the only language he truly understood. He shot up from his stool, the legs screeching against the worn linoleum floor. "You son of a bitch," he snarled, and shoved me hard in the chest with both hands. I'd been expecting it, braced for it. I stumbled back a few steps, but kept my footing. The shove didn't hurt me, but it did exactly what I had hoped it would. In that instant, every other sound in the bar ceased. The game on the TV, the low murmur of conversations, the clinking of glasses. It all stopped. The bartender, a couple of guys sitting in a booth, even his friends just coming back inside. They were all looking at us. They had just seen Robert Henderson, completely unprovoked, physically attack a man 20 years his senior. They had seen his true nature erupt from behind the flimsy facade. I didn't even look at Robert. I just held the bartender's gaze for a long moment. He gave me a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was a silent acknowledgement. I saw it. I understand. I had my witnesses. Slowly, deliberately, I bent down and picked up the 3 photographs. I smoothed them out and slid them back into my jacket pocket. I still hadn't said a word to him. There was nothing left to say. I turned my back on him and walked out of the bar, feeling the weight of every eye in the place on my back. The cold night air hit my face, a welcome relief from the stuffy heat inside. I hadn't won with my fists. I had won with the truth. Tonight, Robert's mask had cracked for all to see, and I knew this was only the beginning of it shattering completely. Robert, cornered and publicly shamed, resorted to the cruelest weapon he had left. He started calling my grandchildren, his own kids, feeding them a story about how their mother was sick, how he was so worried, asking them why she wouldn't come home. It was a disgusting, manipulative tactic, a poison dart aimed directly at Sarah's greatest vulnerability, her love for her children. Hearing about it from her tearful son on the phone sent her into a tailspin. I had to sit with her for hours, calmly explaining that this was just a desperate, dirty trick to lure her back into his control. Protecting your kids, I told her, holding her hands firmly in mine, also means keeping yourself safe for them. That's the most important thing right now. A strong mother is the best protection they have. It seemed to help anchor her, to give her resolve. Frank heard what happened at the bar through the town grapevine, which, in a place this size, works faster than the internet. He didn't say much on the phone, but 2 days later, he showed up at my house with a couple of other guys from our VFW post. They weren't there to talk or offer condolences. They came with tool belts and work gloves. One of them, a retired carpenter, spent the afternoon fixing the section of my back fence that had been damaged in a windstorm last month. Another fired up a lawnmower and took care of my overgrown yard. They worked in a comfortable, quiet rhythm, occasionally exchanging a few words about a stubborn bolt or a dull blade. This is how men of my generation show they care. Not with words, but by showing up and doing what needs to be done. Their silent, steady presence, the simple sounds of productive work, was a profound comfort. Mrs. Halloway called me toward the end of the week. "I've subpoenaed a woman named Denise," she said, her tone all business. "She appears to be Mr. Henderson's girlfriend." It was a brilliant, aggressive move, one I hadn't anticipated. The lawyer wasn't just working with the evidence we gave her, she was actively creating cracks in Robert's world, applying pressure to his weak points. "Men like Robert aren't loyal to anyone but themselves," Mrs. Halloway explained. "When they feel trapped, they'll throw anyone under the bus to save their own skin. We're going to give Ms. Denise an opportunity to save herself first." Faced with a legal summons and the prospect of being dragged into court and perjuring herself, Denise chose to cooperate. Mrs. Halloway took her deposition and called me afterward to summarize. Denise admitted she'd seen Robert be cruel to Sarah on multiple occasions. She described one specific incident where he had slapped Sarah across the face during an argument, right in front of her, and then mocked her for crying. Her testimony was priceless. It was an objective, third-party account from inside his own circle that completely dismantled the "it was just a marital spat" defense that Robert was undoubtedly planning to use. The story from O'Malley's continued to ripple through town. The bartender called me one afternoon, his message brief and to the point. "Anything you need, Lieutenant, any statement, you just let me know." One morning, I opened my front door to find a basket of fresh blueberry muffins on the porch with a small, unsigned note that simply read, "We're with you." The same neighbors who hadn't wanted to get involved were now choosing a side, albeit quietly. The community's passive indifference was slowly being replaced by a quiet, powerful current of support. It gave me strength. Most importantly, I saw a change in Sarah, a profound shift. She started reading the legal documents Mrs. Halloway sent over, highlighting sections and writing notes in the margins, asking sharp, intelligent questions about the case. She was no longer just a passive observer in her own rescue. She was becoming an active participant in her own liberation. One evening, as we were looking over some papers at the kitchen table, she looked at me, her eyes clear and resolute. "Dad," she said, "I want to be in court. I want to testify." Looking at her then, I no longer saw fear. I saw a cool, hard resolve that reminded me so much of her mother. The legacy of Martha, her unshakable strength, was finally rising to the surface. Watching the community start to step up, even in small ways, really drove home the power of solidarity. Sometimes just a quiet word or a simple gesture of support can make all the difference to someone who's struggling. For those of you listening, have you ever had a neighbor or an old friend show up for you when you needed it most? I'd be interested to hear your stories in the comments. That weekend, the weather turned beautiful, a perfect, crisp autumn afternoon, the kind that feels like a gift. Sarah went out into the backyard to the small rose garden Martha had planted and tended to so carefully over the years. I watched her from the kitchen window, a mug of coffee warming my hands, as she began to methodically pull weeds from around the thorny bushes. There was a peacefulness to her movements, a gentle rhythm. Seeing her there, surrounded by her mother's flowers, the sunlight warming her face, was like looking at a painting of the peace she deserved every single day, not just in stolen moments. She was slowly, quietly reclaiming a part of herself, tending to the soil of her own life. She reached down to pull a stubborn weed growing deep near the base of a rose bush, and the sleeve of her sweatshirt slid up past her elbow. And then I saw it. On the back of her hand, a small, perfectly round scar, a pale white circle of puckered tissue against her skin. It didn't look like an accidental scar from a cut or a scrape. It was too neat, too symmetrical, too perfectly circular. I put my mug down on the counter and walked outside, my heart pounding a slow, heavy, painful rhythm against my ribs. I knelt in the cool grass beside her. "This one," I said, my voice barely a whisper as I pointed to the mark. "When did this happen?" Sarah didn't look at me. Her gaze was fixed on the scar as if she were seeing it for the first time, a relic from a past she'd tried to bury. "Last Christmas," she whispered, her voice cracking. "He was mad because dinner was late. The roast was a little dry. It was a cigarette." I don't remember standing up. I don't remember walking back into the house. The next thing I knew, I was down in the basement, in my small workshop. The raw, clean smell of sawdust and machine oil has always been a calming thing for me, a scent of order and creation. I grabbed a scrap piece of pine and flipped the switch on my belt sander. The machine roared to life, filling the small space with a deafening whine, vibrating through the concrete floor. I pressed the wood against the spinning belt, watching the fine dust spray into the air over and over, grinding it down until the surface was as smooth as glass. A slap, a punch. Those are acts of rage, of lost control. But a cigarette burn? That's not losing control. That is a deliberate act of torture. That is malice. That is an evil that goes beyond simple anger, and he had done that to my little girl. I shut off the sander, and in the sudden, ringing silence that followed, I pulled out my phone and called Mrs. Halloway at home. My hand was shaking, not with fear, but with a pure, cold fury. I told her about the scar. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint scratching of a pen on paper. "Tomas," she finally said, and her voice was heavy with a new gravity. "This changes everything. This isn't just assault anymore. This could elevate the charges from 3rd degree to 2nd. It demonstrates a pattern of calculated cruelty, not just impulsive violence. We need to get that photographed immediately." When I went back upstairs, Sarah was still sitting in the garden, tears silently streaming down her face. I sat down on the grass next to her. This time, I took her hand, gently turning it over to look at the scar. "The lawyer needs a picture of this," I said softly. "She says it's important, very important." Sarah nodded, still crying, but she didn't pull her hand away. She let me look at it, at the physical proof of the shame and pain she had hidden for so long, even from me. Bringing it into the light, as painful as it was, felt like the beginning of an exorcism. It was no longer her secret to bear alone. That evening, a new resolve settled over Sarah. She sat with me and went over the initial police report I had filed weeks ago. She read every line, every word, her expression intent. "There are things missing," she said, her voice stronger now, steadier. "Details I was too scared to remember then. There were other times. I can remember them now." For the first time, she was no longer the passive subject of her own story. She was becoming its author, its primary witness. A powerful witness, ready to confront her tormentor and speak her truth, not just for herself, but for all the others who couldn't. A week before the court date, a storm rolled in, the kind of furious Midwestern thunderstorm that feels like the sky is trying to tear itself apart. Rain lashed against the windows, and the wind howled around the corners of the house. Around 10 o'clock, there was a pounding at the front door. Not a knock, a frantic, desperate hammering. I looked through the peephole. It was Robert. He was a pathetic sight, soaked to the bone, his hair plastered to his forehead, his eyes wild and bloodshot. The reek of whiskey was so strong I could practically smell it through the thick oak of the door. He'd been served with the final court summons and the upgraded charges. The reality of his situation had finally penetrated his alcoholic haze. He was terrified. I opened the door just a few inches, leaving the heavy brass security chain engaged. "What do you want, Robert?" I asked, my voice as cold and hard as the rain falling behind him. The words came tumbling out of him in a desperate, slurred rush. He was sorry. He loved Sarah. He was going to get help, go to rehab. He blamed his job, the stress, money problems, anything and anyone but himself. "Please, Dad," he said, using a word he rarely ever used with me, his voice cracking with false sincerity. "Just talk to her. Get her to drop the charges. Don't ruin my life." I just stared at him in silence, letting him perform his sad one-man play on my doorstep. When he saw the pleading wasn't working, he switched tactics, trying to wield guilt as a weapon. He brought up the children. "Think about your grandkids," he whined, his voice taking on a pitiful tone. "They need their father. You don't want them to come from a broken home, do you?" He was trying to twist it, to make us the villains, the ones responsible for breaking up the family, not the man who had fractured his wife's rib. That was it. That was the last straw. My patience, worn thin over weeks of anger and anxiety, finally snapped. "You broke this family, Robert," I said, my voice low and even, but with an edge as sharp as a razor. "You shattered it. You lost the right to speak your children's names the night you put your hands on their mother. You lost that right when you pressed a cigarette into her skin." I looked him dead in the eye, letting him see the full measure of my contempt. "Now get off my porch, and don't ever come back." I didn't wait for a reply. I shut the door in his face. The solid thud of heavy wood echoed his pathetic departure. I threw the deadbolt. The sharp click of the lock was a sound of absolute finality. Outside, I could hear him cursing, his voice swallowed by the storm, and then the sound of his stumbling footsteps fading away as he retreated back into the night. The entire confrontation lasted maybe 3 minutes, but it felt like a lifetime. I didn't feel a sense of triumph. I just felt a profound, bottomless contempt. The man who acted so tough when his fists were flying was nothing more than a sniveling coward begging in the rain. When I turned around, Sarah was standing at the top of the stairs, wrapped in her bathrobe. She'd heard everything. There were no tears in her eyes, just a stunning, quiet calm. She looked at me, and for the first time in a very long time, a small, genuine smile touched her lips. Neither of us said a word. We didn't need to. Tonight, the monster had shown its true face, had revealed the pathetic weakness at its core. And we both knew we were ready. The morning of the trial, an unusual quiet filled the house. I was up before dawn, making coffee, the familiar ritual, a small anchor in the storm of the day ahead. The aroma of brewing coffee was a small, normal comfort. Sarah came downstairs already dressed in a simple blouse and slacks. She looked composed, professional, but I could see the way she was tightly clasping her hands together in her lap, her knuckles white. I didn't offer any empty platitudes like, "It'll all be okay." Words like that felt cheap today. Instead, I took the silver snowflake necklace out of its box where I'd kept it safe. "Your mother would want you to wear this today," I said, my voice a little rough. I fastened the delicate chain around her neck. It was my way of telling her she wasn't going into this alone. She was carrying her mother's strength, her mother's love, with her. The courtroom felt cold and impersonal, a cavernous room that smelled of old wood polish and the faint, dusty scent of paper. It was a stage built for judgment. Robert sat at the defendant's table in a cheap-looking suit that was a size too big for him, trying to project an image of a respectable citizen. But the nervous darting of his eyes, the sheen of sweat on his upper lip, betrayed him. We sat in the front row. I could feel the tension radiating from Sarah beside me, but she kept her back straight, her shoulders squared. She never once looked in Robert's direction. Her gaze was fixed on the witness stand, the place where, in a few moments, she would finally tell her story in her own voice. When her name was called, she took a deep, steadying breath and stood up. Her walk to the stand was not the walk of a victim. It was steady, each step deliberate and sure. As she placed her hand on the Bible and swore the oath, her voice trembled only slightly. But when she sat down in that chair, facing the judge and the jury, a visible change came over her. It was as if the weight of all the years of silence was physically lifting from her shoulders, replaced by a formidable resolve that was breathtaking to witness. She was no longer the broken woman who had collapsed on my porch. She was a survivor, and she was here to claim what was hers, the truth. Our lawyer, Mrs. Halloway, began her questioning, her voice calm and methodical, and Sarah began to speak. Her voice, at first quiet, grew stronger and clearer with every word. "I've listened to hundreds of testimonies in my career, sat through hours of harrowing stories, but hearing my own daughter recount the details of her abuse, it felt like a physical pressure building in my chest, a vice tightening around my heart." She described the punch, The sickening feeling of being kicked in the ribs, the humiliation of being locked in a room for hours. When the lawyer asked about the scar on her hand, a hush fell over the entire courtroom. Sarah simply held up her hand, turning it so the overhead lights caught the small, white circle of raised tissue. It was a silent piece of evidence more powerful than 1,000 words, an undeniable brand of his cruelty. Robert's lawyer tried to tear her down on cross-examination. He was slick, trying to paint her as jealous, as hysterical, as prone to exaggeration. But Sarah didn't fall into his trap. She didn't get angry or emotional. She met every slimy insinuation with the cold, hard facts, her voice never wavering. "He pressed a lit cigarette into my skin because he said the pot roast was dry," she said, her voice ringing with an unshakable clarity in the silent room. "Would you call that an exaggeration, sir?" the lawyer faltered. "I saw him shuffle his papers, flustered and defeated. He knew, and everyone in that room knew, he had lost. You can't argue with the truth that simple, that ugly." When the jury filed back in after what felt like an eternity and the foreman, a stern-looking woman in her 50s, read the verdict, "Guilty on all counts," I didn't feel a rush of elation. It was something deeper, quieter. A profound sense of relief, as if a heavy weight I'd been carrying on my shoulders for weeks had finally been set down. I looked over at Sarah. Tears were streaming down her cheeks, but she was silent, her head held high. These weren't the tears of pain I had seen before. They were tears of catharsis, of release. She had done it. She had faced her monster in the light of day, and she had won. And in that moment, watching my daughter reclaim her own life, I had never been prouder of anyone in my entire life. Walking out of the courthouse, the fresh, clean air felt like a blessing. It was like emerging from a dark, suffocating cave into the sunlight after a long, long time. We didn't talk much on the way to the car. The world outside was unchanged. Traffic flowed, people hurried along the sidewalks, living their ordinary lives, oblivious to the monumental battle that had just been won inside that stone building. But for us, everything was different. The legal battle was over, but I knew the real journey, the journey of healing, was just beginning. The wounds on the soul don't vanish with a judge's gavel. A few weeks later, Sarah found a small, sunlit apartment on the other side of town. She painted the walls herself, a cheerful shade of yellow, and spent weekends hunting for furniture at thrift stores and garage sales. I went over one Saturday to help her assemble a bookshelf. Watching her confidently handle a power drill, a tool she'd never touched before, I couldn't help but smile. Each screw she drove into the wall was a small act of independence, a declaration that she was building her own life now, on her own terms, with her own two hands. On my last day at the precinct, the day I officially retired, I cleared out my desk. I packed my lieutenant's badge and my service weapon into a cardboard box, alongside 40 years of memories. For my entire adult life, that uniform had defined me. But as I looked around the empty office, I realized the most important case of my entire career was one that never had an official file number, one that never crossed this desk. It was the fight for my daughter. And in that fight, I wasn't acting as a cop. I was just a father, doing what a father is supposed to do. I started spending more of my new free time at the VFW Post, not just for coffee and card games anymore. Frank and we started a small, informal support group, a place where other fathers and grandfathers, men from our generation who were taught to keep their problems to themselves, to carry their burdens in silence, could talk about the complicated family issues they were facing. We didn't offer advice. We just listened. And sometimes that's all a man really needs, a safe place to speak the truth without judgment. One evening, my phone rang. It was Sarah. Her voice was bright and full of a lightness I hadn't heard in it for years. She told me about her new job at the local library, how much she loved being surrounded by books, by quiet and order. She told me about a pottery class she had signed up for, how good it felt to create something with her hands. "You know, Dad," she said, and I could hear the smile in her voice. "I laughed today, a real, deep belly laugh, the kind that makes your sides hurt." I was quiet for a moment, swallowing past the lump that had formed in my throat. A laugh, such a simple thing, but it was the surest sign of healing I could have asked for, a sound more beautiful than any music. "That's good to hear, sweetheart," I finally said, my own voice thick with emotion. "That's real good." Now, sometimes, I sit out on my porch as the sun goes down, casting long shadows across the lawn, and I think about the journey we went on. I learned that true strength isn't about hiding your pain or toughing it out in silence. It's about having the courage to face the truth, no matter how ugly it is. It's about having the wisdom to ask for help when you need it. And it's about taking action, not with blind rage, but with purpose and clarity and a love so fierce it can burn away the darkness. My story might have reached its conclusion, but I know there are other fathers, other grandfathers out there who are just beginning a fight of their own, standing watch in the dark. And I hope if they hear this, it lets them know one thing: you are not alone, and you are a hell of a lot stronger than you think.